Great. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning and again giving us an hour of your time. My name is Jesus Guzman. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director here for Generation Housing. Buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Jesús Guzmán. Soy el director de Política y Abogacía aquí con Generation Housing. And want to start with a few technical features for our webinar today. First, we do have Spanish interpretation available. Tenemos interpretación en español para este evento. El audio está siendo transmitido en español. A favor de oprimir el botón al fondo de su pantalla y seleccionar el botón en español para poder escuchar este evento en español. And again, we are live broadcasting this event with simultaneous Spanish interpretation. You can find access to that at the bottom of your page and just clicking the Spanish button there for live simultaneous Spanish translation. Great. And want to thank Gabriel Gutierrez again for providing live interpretation today. So Gabriel, thank you again for being with us. And just one last note on web participation. We will have audience Q&A later in today's webinar in the second half. And so you'll find a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and click on that, add your questions there. And then we do encourage folks to upvote their questions, which will allow us to be able to have some of those questions rise to the top that are most popular and make sure those get asked of the panelists today. So again, those two functions you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So welcome everyone to today's webinar on preserving opportunity, local lessons on preserving affordable housing. This event is being hosted by Generation Housing as part of Affordable Housing Month, which is a regional effort at helping educate and engage the community around the need for affordable housing and some of the excellent work that's happening to ensure that everyone has access to housing. Generation Housing, just a little bit about our organization. Generation Housing is a independent nonprofit organization created to advocate for the housing and home building needed to support our community's health, education, environment, and economy. So I want to review the agenda with everyone today. We've got an hour, and again, thank you for giving us that hour of your time to be with us. We will, from 11 to 12, be covering a few items. We just went through Generation Housing, a little bit about us, and Affordable Housing Month. I'll be sharing a few remarks about housing preservation, just to help set the context and frame the conversation for today. We'll then have a few minutes for each of our panelists that is with us today to share some opening remarks. And then we'll really spend most of the discussion today with a moderated discussion. We have a set of questions that will help facilitate that conversation. And like I said at the top of the webinar, we also will spend about 10-15 minutes towards the end for audience Q&A. And so really thank you for adding those questions in. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So we're really excited that today's webinar will feature a really wonderful set of speakers who have valuable firsthand insights on housing preservation. First, we have Megan Basinger. She's the Housing and Community Services Manager with the City of Santa Rosa. We then have David Hagele, City Council Member for the City of Healdsburg, who is also joining us today. And third, we have Larry Florin, Chief Executive Officer for Burbank Housing. And you'll get to hear from them in just a moment. I want to share just a couple of other items in terms of some of the goals for today's webinar. First, really it's a chance, I think this webinar to highlight housing preservation, which is one of the three high-level action items or high-level actions to help address housing. I think commonly known as the 3 Ps. Really the second goal is to help share with the community some of the work and findings from local efforts focused on preserving affordable housing. So want to share just a few words about housing preservation before we get to our first panelist, to again help frame the conversation. The solutions to the Bay Area's housing problems are many. There's a lot of solutions out there, but I think one of the ways that the strategy has been formulated is around these 3 Ps, these high-level action items known as the 3 Ps: housing production, preservation, and tenant protections. And today's webinar is going to focus on one of those 3 Ps: preservation. The shortage of about 1.3 million affordable homes in California can't be reversed by new construction alone, although that is and will continue to be an extremely important part of the conversation, an important part of the solution. But one of those strategies that can really help ensure existing affordable housing remains affordable for those who need them the most is preservation. So we have an opportunity to keep our existing stock of affordable homes affordable, whether those homes were built by the private market, affordable housing developers, or local housing authorities. For example, the California Housing Partnership estimates that nearly 32,000 homes of the existing federally subsidized affordable apartments in California are at risk of conversion to market rate in the next 10 years. And of the 32,000, about 9,000 of those are at risk of conversion within the next year alone. And then we also have naturally occurring affordable housing, which refers to residential rental properties that maintain low rents without a federal subsidy. And that's probably the most common affordable housing that we'll find in the US. Recently, we've seen increased efforts by local governments and nonprofit developers in acquiring, rehabbing, and preserving the affordability of older buildings in the open market that currently charge below market rents, but that are of risk of evictions or rent hikes. And so we're really excited to be speaking with a few of the key people and organizations locally involved in helping lead this preservation effort. And first, I want to introduce Megan Basinger. She will be sharing with us some of the work from the city of Santa Rosa. And I want to just share a little bit about Megan to introduce her. She began her career as a planner with the County of Marin. In 2004, Megan joined the city of Santa Rosa and began working on affordable housing developments. During this time, she coordinated the opening and expansion of the Samuel L. Jones Hall Homeless Shelter, administered the Community Development Block Grant and Home Grant programs, and coordinated affordable housing loans for developments throughout the city. In 2011, Megan moved into administrative roles in the city, first with Recreation and Parks, and in 2013 to the Police Department to broaden her exposure to city administration. And in March 2017, Megan became the manager of the Santa Rosa Housing Trust and has been managing the Housing Authority's loan portfolio, overseeing regulatory compliance on over 4,000 units, managing federal grants from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and grants from the state of California. Lastly, Megan received her Bachelor's of Science degree in City and Regional Planning from Cal State University, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and she earned a Master's in Public Administration from Sonoma State. So Megan, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you very much. All right. Are the slides up? There we go. All right. So as Jesus mentioned, I am the manager of the Santa Rosa Housing Trust. This entity was created in December 2002 and is overseen by the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Rosa. Next slide, please. On an annual basis, the Housing Trust has $4 to $5 million to put towards affordable housing loans. This funding group is comprised of federal funds from Community Development Block Grant and Home funds, as well as locally generated funds from our housing in lieu fees, which are housing impact fees, transfer tax, and reserves generated by the Housing Authority. Next slide, please. The Housing Trust operates its funding through annual notices of funding availability. Oftentimes, we're seeing the requests in excess of 300% of the funding available. We just ended a funding cycle on Friday, May 15th, in order to coordinate our loans with the anticipated July tax credit deadline. And we try to assist 2 to 3 projects per year in order to position them for funding and to begin construction. Next slide, please. As Jesus mentioned in my bio, I also oversee the compliance of the Santa Rosa Housing Trust. We have a loan portfolio of approximately $120 million. This covers about 4,000 units, rental, which is about 71% multifamily, 22% senior, and then also we have about 300 ownership units that we oversee, owner occupancy and resales of those units, as well as mobile home rent control, mobile home rehab loans. Next slide, please. And here you can see a map. Last summer, we produced an affordable housing map to illustrate the impact of the Housing Trust efforts throughout the city of Santa Rosa. By color area, we have multifamily, senior, mobile home parks, and then special needs, which are units that are for homeless, mentally disabled individuals. So you can see that these are spread throughout the city of Santa Rosa, which is one of our overarching goals in creating and supporting affordable housing. So that's a quick overview of the Santa Rosa Housing Trust, and I look forward to participating in the conversation.
Great, thank you, Megan. And so we'll get to hear from Megan a little bit more during the discussion section. I want to move to our next panelist, who will be sharing a few opening remarks as well, David Hagele. David currently serves as city council member on the city of with the city of Healdsburg. Mr. Hagele spent his youth overseas living in Japan before returning to the US for his high school years in Lincoln, Nebraska. Following graduation from Pacific Union College in Inglewood, California, Mr. Hagele served as the VP of a private real estate investment firm active in the Western United States and president of the firm's in-house financing, management, and leasing company. In 2004, Mr. Hagele founded DLH Realty Capital, a commercial real estate finance and consulting firm based in Healdsburg, which arranges all types of commercial loans, including SBA, multifamily, vineyard, winery, construction, CMBS, and private bridge financing. In 2016, Mr. Hagele was elected to the City Council for the City of Healdsburg in Sonoma County and was unanimously selected to serve as mayor in 2019. Through his position as an elected official with a background in commercial real estate finance, David does not take for granted the unique position he has to advocate for and find opportunities for potential streamlined funding sources for affordable and workforce housing. David, thank you so much for being with us and welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate you hosting this and having everybody here. Looking at that picture, I can't wait till the hair salons start opening so I can go get my hair cut, that's for sure. But let's see, I had a slide presentation. So what I'd like to do is just do a quick overview of what we've done in Healdsburg when it relates to preserving affordable housing. And to do that, I want to kind of set the stage a little bit. In Healdsburg, there are a number of ballot measures. One of them that really kind of compounded the problem, which is Measure M back in 2000. There was a concern about growth. Gabriel, feel free to raise your hand if I'm talking too fast. And that Measure M restricted our annual building permits to 30 per year in the city of Healdsburg. Affordable housing units were exempt from that, which means units up to 120% AMI. Challenge was not a whole lot could get built without the number of market rate units that would then be able to subsidize those affordable units. In 2016, the voters approved an increase to our transit occupancy tax from 12% to 14%. And so that additional 2% was restricted to affordable housing services and programs. And we were ahead of the curve in doing that. There are a number of cities that have done it in the last couple of years, but ours at 2%, without the recent COVID, would be kicking off about $1 million in funding. And then in 2018, the city council put on the ballot Measure P, which amended our growth management ordinance to exempt units up to 160% AMI of rental to be excluded from the GMO. So that the idea is that could potentially help increase the stock of more income restricted units up to 160% AMI. Our average market rent when we were working on this ballot measure for Healdsburg is about 120% AMI, 125% AMI is where the rents are. Believe it or not, Healdsburg does not have the highest rents in the county. That tends to go down toward Petaluma, where it's closer to a commute area. So our rents are relatively lower compared to a lot of the rest of the county. And then in Measure in 2020 in March, we put on the ballot a minor tweak that expanded the 2018 Measure P to allow for sale units. So this could also allow for income restricted for sale units like condos and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. Real quick, we've also been very aggressive in the creation of affordable housing. And while the city doesn't create it, what we can do is approve projects. And you can see, even with the restrictions of the growth management ordinance and the restriction on market rate housing, this little spreadsheet I put together, just since 2018, there's been a total of 577 units approved. And if you look at the chart below, 66% of those are not subject to the GMO. That means they're below, they're not market rate units. There's some kind of income restriction tied to those units. So for a city our size, that's a big number. So we've been very active, and I speak very highly of our staff in working together to get this done. Next slide, please. So now we come to the preservation side. And what I'd like to do is come back to this slide. If you want to click through the next 3 slides. So these are the units. This was on Prentice Drive, Piper Street, and then University. So now if you want to go back to that other spreadsheet, one more. So the reason, oh, too far. The reason I put this spreadsheet together is this shows what the city's contribution is to these units. And this is a perfect example of partnership. We partnered with Burbank Housing on all of these units. 721 Center Street, that we actually purchased with leftover redevelopment funds. Basically depleted that, we were able to buy that. The cost per door was about $231,000 for those 8 units. And that was acquired just as I came on council. And I remember hearing our housing director at the time describe it as right around Christmas time, being able to go in and tell the tenants, hey, I know your building's for sale, but guess what? We're protecting it. And then we move on to the property on Prentice Street, 23 units. This started with a simple question. A broker called me saying, hey, I'm going to be listing this property. What's going on in the market? Just general questions. At the end of our conversation, I said, hey, do you think the sellers would be interested in letting the city take a run at purchasing the property? The answer was, I don't know. How would that look? And I said, I don't know. Let's figure it out. And I called our city manager, who then got in touch with Larry, and we got working on it right away. And that kind of led to the establishing that creative partnership that we've enjoyed with Burbank Housing. If you want to jump to the, just real quick, so Prentice, you can see at $34,000. The others, the price per door drops substantially in terms of cost to the city. So if you go to the last slide, one more, this one. So this will give you an idea of how we structured these different deals. So Prentice Drive was $5 million. The city contributed $1 million from our Measure S funds, We also had contributed another $275,000 in a loan for immediate rehab and upgrades. The balance then was through Burbank Housing. On Piper and University, we bought those two properties. Again, they came on the market. We were able to put them under contract for $3.1 million. We contributed $550,000. And this is where things got really interesting. And this is something that I think is a good model for other cities to look at. Reach for a Home was able to apply for and receive some HEAP funds, some one-time grant funding from the state. And we were able to use that, give that to Burbank in exchange for some permanent supportive housing units that would then cover, the units scattered between Prentice and the Piper and University properties. And so when you look at the cost of creating permanent supportive housing, it's really expensive. And these acquisitions allowed us to not only preserve our existing affordable housing, but we were then able to kind of cover that spectrum down to the permanent supportive housing side. So the creative solutions that we worked on for Healdsburg is we have the community buy-in through the ballot measures. Affordable housing is an economic development issue. If our employers don't have a place for their employees to live, it's a problem. We partner with the industry experts. The city is not in the property management business. That's where we look to Burbank Housing, Eden Housing, the professionals, so that we're not involved in that we let the professionals do that. Leveraging funds. And the other thing is speed. Speed is really important. So that's why it's important for other cities right now to come up with the framework of how an acquisition to preserve existing affordable housing would be structured. Get all the players in place so that when an opportunity happens, it can move very quickly. So with that, I think that was the end of my slide. I'll wait for questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. Again, really appreciate you being here with us, and looking forward to hearing more from you during the moderated discussion section. Next, I'm excited to introduce Larry Florin. Larry is currently the Chief Executive Officer for Burbank Housing. Larry brings over 30 years of experience in real estate, community and economic development in both the public and private sector to Burbank Housing. Most recently, Larry served as the Director of Housing and Intergovernmental Affairs for Napa County. And prior to joining Napa County, Larry spent 10 years in the private sector. He has over 15 years of experience working in senior management positions in San Francisco, including executive level positions in the Mayor's Office and Redevelopment Authority. Larry, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome.
Thanks, Jesus, and thanks for Generation Housing for establishing this webinar and setting these up. This is a great way to celebrate Affordable Housing Month, and really appreciate Gen H taking the lead on that. And as a commercial plug, Gen H is an increasingly visible organization within the county that was established to really help facilitate the housing, which is in desperate need. Every community poll I'm aware of has identified housing far and above as the most important issue right now. I know the pandemic has clearly been taking that over, but housing is clearly still remains the most important issue, or among the most important issues in Sonoma County. So I really appreciate Gen H being formed and taking the lead on that. So just a little bit about Burbank before I start, since we're often heard but not often understood what we do. Most common thing that I hear is, yeah, I know about Burbank, but not sure what you guys do. So I want to clear that up. Burbank has been around for 40 years now. It was actually started by Sonoma County as what they call captive 501c3 nonprofit. And the original board of directors of Burbank was in the Board of Supervisors and members of the Community Development Commission. In 1995, Burbank actually spun off and became an independent organization, and we exclusively work in the North Bay. Sonoma and Napa County have been our two focus areas, with predominantly Sonoma County being where we focus our energies. All told, since our inception, we have built around 5,000 homes. We currently own, manage about 3,200 homes. We have about 12,000 residents who live in Burbank housing. And this is sort of a scary number, but we have about 15,000 people on our waiting list, which tells you about the great demand and need for affordable housing. Just one anecdote. We have been talking to individuals since the pandemic struck and to see what the economic conditions of our residents are. And most, 72% of our residents have been affected economically, lost wages, lost hours, furloughed, laid off, whatever, different circumstances amongst our residents. So it's affecting our residents disproportionately. The good news is, and we hear this from many of our residents, is they're actually paying their rent because they are so happy to be in affordable housing. Unfortunately, many have to wait many years to get in, and they don't want to lose it. So we think that we are with our partners in the city of Santa Rosa and city of Healdsburg, that we provide a service for this community, and we can be able to provide affordable housing. So David went into a lot of the details about our recent acquisitions. I'm going to add one on there, if you could start the first slide. We traditionally have been a ground up construction company, development company, and that's been our model, mostly using something called low-income housing tax credits. And if any of you are looking for a quick way to fall asleep, I can share with you some of the details at another time about how the tax credit program works. But that's been our primary business, has been low-income new construction. We did do, on occasion, acquisition of existing buildings, but we would repurpose those generally for purposes of gut rehabs and repurposing those buildings. In 2000, I'm going to lose the year on this, and Megan might be able to correct me on this, but we were in 2018, I believe it was, we were presented with this opportunity to purchase an apartment complex in Santa Rosa, Parkwood Apartments. It's on the east side of town. 56 units, the property was up for sale. It was something that was called naturally occurring affordable housing. The residents there were paying around $1,200 to $1,300 a month in rent, which was below market and was kept below market by the family that owned the property. But there was a lot of interest in the project. A lot of folks came in and bid when they put it on the market. We were able to work with the sellers to get them to actually reduce their price somewhat in exchange for them being able to take some kind of a tax deduction by virtue of selling it to us. Burbank is a 501c3 nonprofit. The city of Santa Rosa really stepped up and helped us through this acquisition of this 56 unit building and was able to supply a loan to help us to purchase these, as well as project-based vouchers, which used to be called Section 8 housing choice vouchers, whatever name you want to go by, but they're actual Section 8 vouchers that are attached to units that help you with cash flowing to particular projects, particular properties. So we acquired this building. We used the loan that was granted to us by the city of Santa Rosa, and then Morgan Stanley, which has been extremely active in the fire ravaged areas of particularly Sonoma, but also up in Butte County in terms of providing resources, was able to help us to secure a loan that we were able to, as interim financing, to purchase the property. The goal, or the takeout as you might call it, for the loan, ultimately we are modeling it to be 4% tax credits, which are a form of low-income housing tax credits, and we would be doing renovation to the property. Unfortunately, with the Newsom administration coming in, the focus of the 4% tax credit program has been on new construction. And so it's getting more difficult to acquire these credits these days for acquisition and rehab, as we call them. But we're hopeful that we'll still be able at some point to be able to acquire that. So that's at the 56 unit Parkwood apartment building. We have on-site resident managers, and at most of our properties, we also provide resident services, which are being able to connect folks in the communities to services, whether in the pandemic, might be food bank services, it might be career counseling, it might be after-school programs, but other services that are available, that we make available to our residents. Next slide, please. So after that, and I wanted to give a shout out to, I was still calling Mayor Hagele, he's a council member. I think there should be one more slide. Is that, we go to that? Anyway, there we go. So David already talked a lot about this, but really looked at the city of Healdsburg as a partner. We were approached by the mayor, the city manager, who is unfortunately leaving. David's been a really strong asset for affordable housing, a strong proponent, and I really want to give a shout out to David as he departs the city of Healdsburg, as well as David Hagele, who have really taken the lead on them. And I know that they were concerned about the properties that were mentioned earlier going on the market and being sold for market rate units. As he mentioned, even though the rents are not as high as Petaluma, rents are still pretty high in Healdsburg, and there's there was tremendous demand, I don't know if it still exists, but tremendous demand to acquire properties like this, tear them down, rebuild them as luxury types of homes. And the city of Healdsburg stepped in a big way, was able to provide some seed capital to Burbank and actually tie up the properties themselves and then transfer the properties to Burbank. Again, in both of those cases, Morgan Stanley came in and was able to provide for us funding to be able to acquire the property. It's essentially a 3 to 5 year interim financing that we use, and then with the idea that we would take these loans out with these 4% low income housing tax credits. We're actually submitting we're submitting our application shortly to the California Tax Credit Advisory Committee on Piper University, as well as Montevina, which was the previous slide, I believe, and that was 32 units. The other property that David mentioned, Byfield, formerly called Center Street, was also 8 units, but that continues to be owned by the city of Healdsburg, and we are in fact managing on their behalf. So it's a great model. We love partnering with local communities in this behalf, and what we do is these properties did not have what are called regulatory agreements on them. As a condition of the acquisition, we attach regulatory agreements. They're recorded against the properties. That's what ensures that the rents remain affordable. And the rents on these properties will only grow at the rate, basically the consumer pricing index type of rate, which is 1 or 2% a year. And so we're able to stabilize the rent. The individuals in these units have told us many occasions when we acquire them just how thrilled, happy they are to be able to know that they will not be forced out, that they will buy rent increases, but that they know they'll have stability in their life, which is such an important thing in somebody's life, to be able to deal with something called housing insecurity, but to know that they'll have a roof over their head. Just as an aside, with the health pandemic as it is now waging, one of the increasing, they call it determinants of health, are your housing condition, and being able to provide stable housing is so important to be able, and it's connected to people's health. So anyway, I'll stop talking at that point, Jesus, and be happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Larry. And again, thank you for joining us, and want to thank the rest of the panelists as well. And we'll be taking a few minutes here, take about 10, 15 minutes or so to have a discussion. And so I want to invite David, Larry, and Megan to join us for that. And one question I think that I'd like to start out with just to even take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. And maybe if each of you could help us understand how affordable housing preservation fits into the bigger strategy of trying to address the needs of especially some of the most vulnerable in our community. How does preservation fit into the affordable housing supply? We talk about preservation, protection, production, all really important. It seems from my impression that preservation is probably the lesser of the three that's talked about. So I'm curious to get each of your impressions on sort of the importance and the why around affordable housing preservation.
Be happy to start. I think when Larry talked about Parkwood, one of the immediate attractions that the Parkwood project had was that we are able to assist households instantaneously. So a lot of times when we're focusing on production, we're looking at affordable units that are several years out. So in the case of acquisition and preservation, we can have an immediate impact on the community and provide affordable housing to households right away.
Yeah. I think Megan's got a really good point. It's also, there's a cost efficiency involved in acquisition of existing units. That it's generally the rule of thumb that we've been finding in this market is about $250,000 total acquisition cost per unit. If we're building a new ground up construction, it's going to cost us around double that. You could argue all day long about how we could do that more efficiently. I'm happy to engage in any debate with any discussion, but it's costing about $500,000 per unit to build. That's the reality, an affordable unit. So being able to provide these at a half the price is a big incentive. Being able to keep people in their homes, huge incentive. And I just wanted one other thing that I think was one of the great lost opportunities in the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, 2010 was number of defaults that occurred in the market, and the ability at that point, government did not act aggressively as far as we're concerned to be able to purchase properties that might have been in default and apply regulatory agreements to ensure that they were able to stay affordable. We may be entering a similar situation. We're hoping to become more aggressive in being able to preserve affordable housing.
Yeah, I agree. The key is speed. When we're talking about these crises, that in Sonoma County, we're getting pretty good at dealing with crisis. It's one after the other, and every crisis presents an opportunity to pivot to the positive. And that's what the acquisition of existing. Sorry, my wife is printing something in here. But it gives us an opportunity to pivot to the positive and act quickly when it comes to some of these things. And not only are you improving the housing stock, because a lot of these units, they're not subject to, like Larry said, any of the regulatory agreements for affordable housing and that sort of thing. But it's an opportunity for us as a city to be able to partner in the acquisition of that. We preserve it. Not only do we preserve it where the rent levels stay the same, but we're also improving the quality of those units. The $275,000 that we allocated that we loaned to Burbank allows the improvement. If there are mold issues, some of these units have over time deteriorated because the property owners are mom and pop owners and maybe they couldn't afford to upgrade or improve the unit. So we're able to look at those things and help improve the quality of life for the people that are already here, that already live in our city. The other thing that this kind of comes to me being in the commercial real estate finance side, and then also on the government side with my foot on both sides of the fence, is the RENA numbers that the state mandates you have to create and generate a certain amount of affordable housing units based on population. These formulas that come down, and from a city perspective, there's huge incentive to be able to acquire these units that technically are market rate units right now. They're below market, but they technically are market. just without any kind of a regulatory agreement. And then we can then partner with Burbank Housing. And then once you put that 55-year restriction, deed restriction on those units, we can put them into the RENA number pool. And it's a very quick way for cities to meet that requirement. That I look at it as it's a win-win-win for the residents, for the city, for our businesses who now have the employees that can live and work in town. And I think overall quality of life, everything, it's a complete package. So the preservation, I think, is something that is very crucial. It's a very crucial piece of the overall picture.
So David, I think, brings up an interesting point around both the importance of housing preservation, but I want to dig into, I think, one of the pieces that David and Megan, I think on the side of the city, I'm curious to hear from both of you in terms of what it was like sort of developing this relationship with Burbank Housing and other nonprofit housing developers when approaching this topic. I think one of the things that would be really interesting to hear more about is sort of what it takes to be able to get something like this done, and really starting with sort of the relationships that it takes and who's got to be at the table to be able to make these things happen. So the city, obviously, in needing that will there, partnering with a nonprofit housing developer, but who else has to be there at the table, and what does it take to sort of make sure that these projects are able to go forward?
So in the case of the Parkwood Apartments, Burbank brought the opportunity to the city of Santa Rosa through our notice of funding availability process. And we worked with Burbank, with their lender, Morgan Stanley. And so part of that was being flexible with the timing, understanding various aspects of the transaction. I think when David was talking about the regulatory agreement, an important component was the pre-acquisition surveys of the tenants. So understanding the tenant population and making sure that we're able to fit the regulatory agreement and the funding around that population so they're not displaced, so that those individuals and households can stay in the complex if that is in fact their desire, and that they'll have affordable rents into the future. So just making sure that you have the city staff resources that understand those aspects of the transaction and your various funding sources, and then working well with the other consultants that Burbank or other developers may bring into the transaction so that we can get the deal done.
And the one thing I'll add is, just in terms of a philosophy, is have, I work in spreadsheets, have your spreadsheet, your underwriting models done. A lot of cities and governments want to focus on the funding first. But if you have these things done, there are ways to get the funding. I've found that when you're talking about preserving affordable housing, it was really important for the city of Healdsburg to understand how Burbank underwrites an acquisition. Then when we get approached by brokers or owners that, hey, I think I want to sell this, the properties we acquired, the owners have known their tenants for 20, 30 years, some of them, so the last thing they want to do is just say, all right, gone, because they do have a relationship with the tenants. But it was really important for the city of Healdsburg, and this kind of goes back to what Larry was saying. Our city manager, David McCallion, really understands the underwriting. We now have a housing director, Stephen Sotomayor, who's been excellent in all of this, brings a lot of experience to the table. So we have these pieces, but it's really important to understand how Larry and Burbank Housing underwrites a property, so that when we get a call, we already can kind of pre-flight it, because there are times when the property might be priced too much. There's, some of the tenants, to Megan's point, they might be making too much. There are all kinds of little nuances, because when Burbank is looking at a property, they're not looking at it like a typical investor that's looking at the rents, debt service coverage ratio, loan to value of this, and go apply for a loan, and then I can increase the rents to make a return. It's a different model that they're looking at. So we need to be able to understand how they do it, so that we can then partner a lot more efficiently and move quickly.
Hey, Sus, maybe I just want to add to what the point David said. On the other side of that, we need to have strong financial relationships, banking relationships, because when we have to be opportunistic. These properties, when they come on the market, it's usually through a public solicitation. Sometimes there'll be some inside knowledge before it comes on the market, in which case you really have to move quickly because they want to put it on the market. But you have to have the resources to be able to tie up the property. We're fortunate in that we do have the balance sheet that allows us to do that, as well as lines of credits with some community development financial institutions. But then I really do want to give a shout out to Morgan Stanley to have the flexibility to be able to understand taking a market rate project to a rent regulated situation. It's not easy to underwrite. And then the sellers generally have to be willing to make some concessions that they might not be willing to make in the open market. So it does take an alignment of interest to do this, but it's possible. But in the real estate market, it's critical. Speed matters, and you have to be able to act quickly to tie something up or you'll lose it.
And I'll just add real quick, from the city standpoint, because there's processes with closed sessions and, council needs to approve, but to kind of help with speed, really what you need is for the broker or the owner to call the city manager or the council member, whoever. But the way it worked was I got a call, I called the city manager, and it really just, if there's an opportunity, then we can be called in the closed session, have a discussion. We can't, give direction. We can't take action within that meeting, but we can also, the city manager is then able to negotiate and kind of get, with real estate, there's a saying, you tie it up and then you negotiate. So it's important to get it under contract. Once you're under contract, then you have your due diligence period where then we can fine tune the details with Burbank Housing and the financing, and there, like Larry said, there's a whole layer of approval processes, the tenant interviews, as well as the physical inspections. But some of those are things that the city staff might be able to do, or Larry has a team that can go in and quickly do the inspection. So there are a lot of pieces like that, but it's everybody working together with a common goal. And the relationships that Burbank has over the years, when they go to Morgan Stanley knows their track record. So when Burbank is bringing another project, it's starting from a positive place of, all right, I think we can do this one. And that's where everybody understanding the process is a huge help.
So I want to ask one last question before we move to audience Q&A. We have a few questions, and we're coming close to the top of the hour here. So briefly, I would ask from each of you what your one or two pieces of advice would be, either to other local jurisdictions that are interested in looking at this kind of an opportunity, or to any apartment owners, folks that are potentially looking to sell and maybe considering something like this. So any bits of advice that you have to offer?
I'll jump in. Call and be prepared. So if you care about your tenants and you're looking to transition, you're retiring or whatever, you have a building to sell, call and again, try to understand how the process works so that you have the opportunity to work with us to be able to transition your property from where it is now into something that does help preserve the neighborhoods and the people that are living there.
And I'd say from a local government lending perspective, it's having the financial resources to provide the assistance, because it is the soft debt that's provided by the cities and counties that really makes these projects able to operate and have the affordable rents for the tenants. So that is a key component that needs to be kept in mind.
And I'm just going to add that we consider both Megan and David and the cities of Healdsburg and Santa Rosa be our partners. And we look at transparency, being able to share the information we have as we acquire the properties, We understand that they have to go through process, and we're well aware of that, but being able to move quickly, being transparent with the information that we are able to accumulate, and then being able to tie it to a public policy goal that the community has. So preservation, as is mentioned, Jesus mentioned, is one of the 3 Ps. It's so important to be able to preserve our existing naturally occurring affordable housing stock, and just being able to tie that as a policy to the local government's goals.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm going to move us to the audience Q&A. We have a few questions here, and we'll try to get to at least a couple of questions before we wrap up in a few minutes. First question we have asks, there are many mentions of opportunities arising for preservation and the need for speed. Is anyone assessing potential older market rate properties for future preservation city by city?
Well, I think this goes back to having the plans in place, ready to jump, because these are all properties that are owned by individual owners. And granted, you could go out and approach them, but right now, cities' resources are pretty limited. So I think it is important to have those partnerships, have the understanding, so your team is ready to pounce when something's available. And then there's the other partnership with the brokerage community, the realtors and the real estate agents and brokers. That's ground zero for any real estate activity, people moving, buying, selling, keeping that relationship with them so that the cities, or Burbank or the affordable housing providers hear about the opportunities first before they're officially listed. It all goes back to the relationships and being ready to move once an opportunity presents itself. And I think just getting the word out that, hey, our team is in place, so that you get the call, so that you have an opportunity to look at something. And if it doesn't work, you can say, hey, it doesn't work for us in this model.
Great. Thank you, David. Barring no other comments on that question, I'll move to the second question. So we have a question here that asks, it states at the front, I have a concern for the disabled community DSLC serves. Most are extremely low income and have a difficult time locating and securing low income housing. There just isn't enough extremely low income housing. Is this being considered? And the second part to that question is, as Sonoma County and the city of Santa Rosa begins to develop, will ADA units be made available? And what type of styles will be developed? The communities are building more townhome styles, and this presents an extreme barrier for so many with mobility issues. Will this be considered as well? So open that up.
Be happy to jump on that one first. So one of the priorities of the city of Santa Rosa is to develop extremely low, very low income units. And that's something that we prioritize in each of our developments. We also work with DSLC to provide grants to renters for mobility improvements to their units. And so that's an ongoing program that DSLC operates. And then finally, any project that has public assistance is required to meet the state architect's code for ADA units. So we are required to make sure that a percentage of the units are fully accessible, and that's mobility, sensory improvements.
Yeah, just underscore what the point Megan was making. That was a relatively new change to the code, where which just came in, so that anytime there's public money involved, ADA accessibility is required now. That's new. As far as the other question about very low income, we would say 30 or even 20% AMI and below, and AMI being annual median income. We actually have a project in Santa Rosa that we're hoping to break ground on in the next 6 to 8 months, called Caritas Homes. It will be focused primarily on permanent supportive housing and for very low income housing. It takes a great deal of subsidy to be able to provide units where the rent payers are paying so little rent, but hugely in need. And we're constantly looking for those opportunities. Healdsburg actually was able to put together a partnership with us, with a wonderful nonprofit up there, to be able to get, so we'll have some of the, homes be able to serve the formerly homeless. And those types of partnerships are great. It's what we thrive on and love doing, so.
Wonderful. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Megan. With that, we'll be closing today's webinar. I just want to share a few notes about some upcoming events that are coming up, and we'll share those on the screen here. We have a webinar here on the 27th at 11 a.m. I want to invite everyone to join us to learn more about ADUs and some of the policy changes and resources that are available. We'll have folks from the county and the city of Santa Rosa joining us for that, as well as a new nonprofit, the Napa Sonoma ADU Center, that is offering a number of really excellent resources to help homeowners navigate the ADU regulations and get these built. So join us for that on May 27th, May 28th at 6 p.m. Really excited about this. We have Connor Doherty, the author of Golden Gates Fighting for Housing in America book. He's also a New York Times economics reporter. And if you haven't picked up that book, highly recommend doing so. And then joining us for the conversation with Connor on the 28th at 6 p.m. And again, all of this is part of Affordable Housing Month events that we're hosting here in Sonoma County. And so really excited for those events, and you'll be seeing more about those on our website and Facebook. We'll move to the next slide. And again, just want to thank folks for joining us, our panelists, Larry Florin from Burbank Housing, David Hagele from the city of Healdsburg, and Megan Basinger from the city of Santa Rosa, who has a city council meeting later today that she'll be at, so we'll be letting her go here in just a moment. But again, want to thank them for joining us, and thank you all for being with us. And we'll have this webinar up on YouTube, and we'll share that with everybody who wasn't able to make us, or if you'd like to check it out later, we'll make sure to post that as well. And again, want to thank you all for joining us, and hope you have a good afternoon. Thanks, everyone.